Very welcome to the third of our webinars dealing with various issues related to journalism, the media and COVID-19. We'll just give people a few moments to log in. We're live on Zoom, of course, which is probably where you're seeing us. And at the same time, we're broadcasting on Facebook Live, where you can find us, facebook.com/Jokoza, Jocoza. I'm seeing somebody from Uganda. I'm seeing somebody from Auckland, New Zealand. That's amazing. I don't know what time of the day it is in Auckland, but you're very welcome. We're glad that you could make us. If there are other people from outside South Africa, just signal, greet us on chat so that we can welcome you in. Joe Bond from Auckland is telling us that it's just gone 10 o'clock in the evening on that side. Anyone else from outside the country, please do just signal us. There's somebody from Berlin. I'm assuming that's Berlin in Germany. There is also Berlin in the Eastern Cape, but that's a very small place indeed, and I'm guessing it's the big one in Germany. There's somebody from Nigeria. There's of course Muthoki from Kenya. Well, let's get underway. So welcome, and please do continue just noting where you're from so that we can welcome you into this, the webinar. As I said, this is our third webinar in the series organized by Wits Journalism. Welcome to it. We dealt with fake news 2 weeks ago. Last week, we dealt with the economic impact of the crisis. We do have recordings from those on our website, journalism.co.za. I must say that I enjoyed those discussions a great deal, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I hope the tech is working for everyone. If you do have an issue with the tech, please use the chat function to tell us, and we can see whether there's something we can do on our side. Just quickly to go through one or two house rules before we get going. Firstly, as those of you who've been with us before, those of you who've been on a Zoom webinar before, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please do use that to participate through questions or comments, and we'll try and bring those into the discussion. Secondly, tweet early, tweet often. Use our hashtag Midweek webinar, and I think there are one or two other hashtags that are applicable, but certainly that one would be great. We are recording, and we will make the recording available afterwards on our website again, and you can listen back to it there. We also, just for the record, say that your continuing participation signals that you're okay with that. So today, we're talking about the way in which the COVID crisis has impacted on the way journalism is practiced, both here in South Africa and across the world. There are so many different issues to discuss. Newsrooms have had to radically revisit the way they work to ensure that reporters remain as safe as is humanly possible. So that means that our TV screens have TV reporters in face masks, which is really an adjustment that I'm still having to make. Newsrooms that are empty as journalists work from home, and much else. It imposes a new set of pressures and anxieties around personal safety, around the impact on people's own families, around job security, and many other issues. I've also been wondering about how it changes our relationship with our audiences. Journalists are affected by this crisis as much as everyone else, in a way that is true, I think, for few other stories. We often hear the metaphor of war being used with regard to COVID. We must defeat the virus, which is an unseen enemy. This is the kind of language that keeps being used. It makes me think that perhaps in this case, journalists are embedded much in the way that they are sometimes embedded with an army. Are we embedded among the troops fighting COVID-19? And what implications does that hold for how we cover the story? But maybe we should move to more practical questions. And before I go to the panel, I thought I would play a short video clip produced by Eyewitness News in which some of their reporters talk about what it is like reporting the crisis. Give me a second as I call it up. course, I don't find it. Excuse me for the delay, but I think I've got it now. Here we go. So this is a recording, that was a short clip that was produced by Eyewitness News to give people an insight into how their reporters are covering, are affected by covering the story. In the webinar. Thanks. So I know that the audio there was not so great, but I'm hoping that through the subtitles you got a sense of what was being said. So let me just introduce today's panel. Firstly, there is Chiara Carter, the editor of the Daily Dispatch in East London, and again, I'm not going to read out long bios. We've got Katy Katopodis, who's news director of the TV channel Newzroom Afrika, and Muthoki Mumo, Sub-Saharan representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists in Nairobi. So let me start with you, Chiara. You're an example of exactly what we're talking about. You told me yesterday that you're editing the Daily Dispatch, which is in East London, sitting in Cape Town. So let me ask you this, how's it going? And how do you keep your reporters safe while ensuring that the story is told?
Well, how's it going? Yeah, I ended up being in Cape Town because I commute. My family live in Cape Town just before lockdown. So because most of our senior staff and a number of reporters are working remotely, I stayed on here. It's a very different way of working. I really miss being in a newsroom, Katy. I was so envious hearing you say you're going to keep the newsroom a bit quiet. And I miss the people. But it has worked very well so far. That's the amazing thing. I think because we've got a very strong team and we're a small group, so it's quite easy to stay in contact the whole time. Some people are still working from the office on and off. Photographers and reporters go in there to meet up, to go out on assignments, and our deputy and news editor are there every day. But it's pretty much a shell of a building at the moment. Everyone else is working remotely. We've had quite strict protocols. Almost before the lockdown, we were anticipating this was coming. So we'd got in some protective equipment ahead of time. And we've added to that since then. Because there's so few staff coming into the building, it's quite easy to ensure that they adhere to those protocols. Now, when more people come back, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, I think. And just getting reporters used to the idea of working at a distance. I mean, usually I'm telling people, get out of the office and go and be where the story is happening. Now we're saying where you don't have to go, rather use the phone. But obviously still our reporters are out there all the time and they are using the protective equipment. They've had to get used to how to put it on, how to take it off, where to dispose of things. It's a very different thing for journalists because, I mean, it's almost the opposite of what we do. We tend to be quite gung-ho and just go out there and do the story. Now you're having to think very carefully about yourself and your colleagues and their safety and the safety of members of the public who are interacting with you.
You were telling me yesterday about covering Fort Glamorgan, which is of course the big jail in East London where there had been an outbreak. I mean, in a situation like that, how do you balance the risk against the importance of getting the story in?
Yeah, look, that story was actually broke over a weekend. And I was alerted by our investigations editor, Bongani Fazile, that the reporters were going out there and that they'd been told the briefing would be inside the prison, and he was concerned. And we then spoke to the reporters and said, look, there's a line you cannot cross. You cannot go in there. We don't know what the situation is at the moment. If you went in, we'd have to think through very carefully your safety. So as far as possible, speak to the officials and the ministers outside of the prison on the outskirts, which is what happened. We have fairly good contacts within prisons, prisoners as well as staff. So we were pretty well informed on what people were saying was happening. And then we had to cross-check those facts with the spokespeople. There is a limit, obviously, because we're relying, I note, quite heavily on officials to work with us and to give us accurate information, probably relying on them more than we would in a freer kind of situation of being able to go and check for ourselves.
So let me turn to Katy. I mean, you're in a TV newsroom, and of course, TV needs pictures. It needs to be on the scene. How's Newzroom Afrika dealt with this, with reporting under these conditions?
So, Franz, you know, we've really tried to take as much of a proactive stance as possible. And before even the president declared a national disaster or he put the country into lockdown, we've put some protocols in place. So for starters, we've tried to thin the newsroom out as much as we possibly can. It's not always practical because it's a very visual medium. The other reality is that the equipment that we have to make television come alive without boring everybody with the technicalities. The licenses are literally only in this Linden building here. So it's very difficult for many people to work remotely outside of the newsroom. The broader office and the support services are working remotely, and we do have our news our news team here as thinned out as far as possible. What we also did was we put protocols in place in terms of hand sanitizers, washing of hands when you walk into the building. I'm wearing here a mask, which I put on every time I walk around. It's mandatory if you walk into the building and around the building that you have a mask on. We've encouraged people to make their own masks if they can, or to get something that's very reasonable. We have checks and screening at the entrance, so your temperature is taken at the entrance. And if it's 37.3 degrees, that's our benchmark, then you are potentially flagged as somebody who needs to go and get screened and or tested. And so we've really put health above all. And we've encouraged our reporters as well, because as Chiara rightly says, we're in the field all the time. And our reporters who are in the field need to take these protective measures and constantly be aware of social distancing. You know, boom mics are now at play. They're wearing masks. You see them on television with masks. It's become our new reality. We've played around with how does it work. You know, sometimes you'll see a reporter with a mask hanging around them, hanging around their jawline, if they're in an area with nobody else around them. But where they're interviewing people, then we've encouraged everybody to please put their masks on, because it's always safety and health first. That is our absolute priority. The other dynamic is that guests coming into the channel are not physically coming. So we've had to get used to Skype and Zoom and doing all of those, and crossing our fingers and praying that technology doesn't let us down, because there's just so much we can control from our building, but you never know what somebody's Wi-Fi or bandwidth is like in their own home. So you've set up a minister, for example, and you've got a perfectly good visual of them. Halfway through the interview, someone in their home, for example, may decide to start streaming Netflix, and it affects the Wi-Fi, and there goes your interview. So we've had to be very agile with troubleshooting, moving to phone interviews very quickly, and just understanding that this is our new reality at the moment, and we need to deal with it as much as and as best as we possibly can.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge, as you say, for all of us in all sorts of different ways. And I suppose one of the opportunities of a discussion like this is to exchange notes, in a sense, of what is essential, what is working, and what is not. Muthoki, let me ask you, I mean, what is best practice that you're seeing across the continent for dealing with this new reality? You'll just need to unmute yourself. Yeah, there we go.
Yes, I just realized that. First, let me say thanks for having me. In terms of best practice, I always hesitate, and we always hesitate in providing standards, just because every country is different and journalists are operating within different political contexts and within different economic contexts, and also the regulations differ from place to place. So for instance, here in Kenya, we can't go out in public without having the face mask, but that's not the situation across the region. So when you speak to the journalists, we try text and to explain to them and to try and customize the safety advice that we have in place for that. So in terms of the safety advice that we're providing, it's quite extensive in multiple languages, so it would be a little difficult to go into all, but just a few key things that I would say. There's the that have been given to the public in general about how to avoid infection and how to deal with yourself once you think you have infection. So the basics like washing the hands, wearing masks if you're required to do so. But then we're also advising journalists to take extra measures if they're going into places where there might be risk of infection. So for instance, there was a mention of prison. So in prisons, in detention centers, in health facilities. And I would really rather just share all of that material in the chat and provide a link to everyone, because I hesitate to just try to cover all of it, because it's quite extensive and it's very contextual.
Sure, thank you. I mean, you were telling me earlier that, I mean, one of the big concerns in many other parts of Africa is about free, be moving around under lockdown. I don't think we've had as many of those sorts of issues here. But that's what you're finding, is it? That people in many countries are really not able to get out to do the story?
So what we're finding is that when governments are putting down restrictions on public gatherings, is that there is an explicit declaration that journalists are part of the essential services. We've seen this in Somalia, we've seen this in this in Uganda. This is the theory. Practice is different. We've spoken to journalists in Uganda, for example, who tell us they're essentially stuck in their neighborhoods or in their villages unless they can get these government stickers that allow them to move around to go beyond their neighborhood. Because in Uganda, public and private transport has been banned essentially unless you have these government stickers that allow you to move around and to drive your car. At the same time, even when journalists are allowed to move around, and they do move around, we see security personnel reacting in a very against the journalists, whether deliberately or simply because they don't understand. For example, again in Uganda, we recently reported of at least 6 journalists who've been beaten, harassed. One of them was beaten so badly, he went into a coma for several hours, just for being outside their homes after curfew, or for trying to report the enforcement of lockdown measures. We've seen similar things happening in Kenya. We've had reports of similar things happening in Somalia. So while some governments are recognizing in theory that journalists need to be able to move around and to report, and the services that they provide are essential to the fight against COVID-19, this is unfortunately in many places happening in theory, but not necessarily in practice.
Thanks very much. Let me, raise a question to, in a sense, all of you. I mean, isn't it inevitable that at some point we will have a journalist who's diagnosed positive? What happens then in your newsrooms, Chiara, Katy? What is there already a protocol? Does everybody have to? Does the workplace get closed down? And what does that mean for the media?
So I can give that a go, Franz. You know, this is something that we're very, very aware of. And if we take what Mr. Mkiza said to us just a few weeks ago, that 60 to 70% of the population is likely at some point to contract COVID-19, then it does mean that at some point somebody will test positive. So we have thought about this. You know, we've got meetings every second day in the building from a management perspective where we talk about what it would look like. And there are definitely protocols in place to help secure everybody in the building, and also to ensure that there are deep cleansers that happen and we're able to clean the area completely. So it's definitely something that we're talking about. In our case, we've got to think about what goes on screen. We're a fairly new business. We're only turning 1 this coming weekend. So we don't necessarily have unlimited resources and studios in different parts of the country. So this is our primary studio. And we've had to have conversations about what we call the play out would look like. You know, is it 6 hours? Is it 12 hours? Is it 18 hours of back-to-back content to allow us an opportunity to come in and ensure that everything is cleaned properly? We've done proper tracking and tracing of individuals who've been in contact with the person who's potentially tested positive. So it's very, very top of mind and daunting, I must add.
I mean, is there a scenario where actually the building gets closed down and nobody can come in at all because of the risk of infection?
There is a scenario. It doesn't last long though, because we've had a look at international protocols as well as local protocols to see what best practice is. And from what we can tell, it's something that can be reopened, or the venue can be reopened again after a few days. So it's not an indefinite closing down of the building.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to turn to some of the emotional issues that the stresses and strains that people have to deal with. I'm going to try and play a clip. I mean, in this case, I don't have subtitles, so I'm going to try and play it as loud as I can. If you can't hear, we'll just stop it. This one comes from Estie de Klerk, a journalist with Radio Sonder Grense, the Afrikaans service of the SABC. So let's try.
I'm sure journalists around the globe are grappling with the same inner turmoil as I. It was during the week that the national lockdown was instituted, with only just a few confirmed cases and no deaths yet, that I was suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling of sadness. It was different from anything else I've ever felt before. It was as if I had to say goodbye.
Can you hear that?
Yes, we can.
To something, but I couldn't figure out what. I've been a radio and television journalist and producer for 21 years. During times when I covered stories in war zones or on continuous township unrest or reported from murder and crime scenes or from courtrooms, devastation and dead bodies could be seen. The enemy was visible. The COVID-19 war we are reporting on now is against an invisible enemy. As journalists, we stay as objective as possible. We cover stories and move out of the thick of things as quickly as we can in order to stay safe. We also hardly ever speak about what we've experienced. Of course, I now realize that what I was feeling covering COVID-19 related stories day after day was grief. I was, and I'm still grieving, while I continue to cover stories on this war. Every night at 7, when my neighbors shout their unwavering support for our country's medical workers, I do so in support of and in solidarity with my fellow journalists.
So thanks to Esti for sending us that that voice note, which I think captures, you know, some of the stresses and strains. Muthoki, what kind of support should employers offer journalists dealing with these kind of stresses and strains?
I mean, I'm really glad that we're talking about mental health right now, because I've noticed as a journalist in the past and working in this job, that is not something that journalists immediately talk about or something that they immediately bring up as a concern. Yes, we talk about the journalists who've been arrested or who've been beaten, but the journalists themselves hardly ever talk about the trauma of this. And this is something that we've been trying to point out as a priority in the safety advice that we're giving: the psychological well-being of the reporters going out on the field, the psychological well-being of reporters stuck in their homes and having to report this crisis needs to be prioritized. So, I mean, in terms of, and I hate to be the person who says everything is contextual, but that's the answer. But it's very basic, that you need to have conversations, not just with your journalists, but also to bring in the family of those journalists. Because especially in this crisis, we're seeing the personal and professional being intertwined so close, and the concerns that the families of journalists have and the concerns that the journalists themselves have do overlap in very worrying ways. Now, in terms of specific tools, yes, newsrooms should make vital mental health experts to speak to their jobs. Also, a lot of resources that are online. The DAP Center for Journalism and Trauma, for instance, has a toolkit that targets specifically journalists who are suffering from mental trauma from covering COVID-19. And we are also able to go into conversations with journalists themselves and with newsrooms to figure out what the context is and what is needed in order to provide the assistance or the help that people suffering from mental trauma out of covering COVID-19 need.
Chiara, what kind of mechanisms are there available to your journalists to access that kind of support?
We do have counselling services available that we can refer staff to, I mean, at any time, and particularly now. And I know our head office and HR have met around this and are very attuned to the possibility that people will have issues, and it might not present now, but afterwards. You know, at the moment, some reporters are carried away by the story, and it's only after covering traumatic events that you start feeling the consequences of that. So it needs to be an ongoing provision. I think because we've got a small newsroom, there's a lot of talking that goes on between people, and that kind of interpersonal support for colleagues is also important. You know, some of our reporters have underlying health issues that make it vital that they continue working remotely for many months to come, probably. And that's it's a very different kind of pressure they're standing out from their colleagues because they cannot come back for probably the next 5-6 months. And the isolation is difficult in that kind of situation. And we need to be quite aware of that people start feeling cut off and unsupported. In rural areas of the Eastern Cape, we have a bureau, we have reporters who cover very vast distances, and there's a kind of a pressure on that too. They're far from the office, they're far from East London, they're having to make decisions on their own, and they're often encountering people who are not fully behind the lockdown, are not taking seriously the kind of social distancing norms that we're seeing in the cities. And we need to talk through with those reporters as well, how they're coping and how they manage with different people they encounter there.
Thanks very much. Just a quick reminder for people who've joined us. My name is Franz Kruger from Wits Journalism, and I'm in conversation with Chiara Carter, the editor of the Daily Dispatch in East London, Katy, Katopodis, the news director at Newzroom Afrika, and Muthoki Mumo of the committee of the CPJ in Nairobi. And we're discussing the ways in which the COVID-19 crisis is affecting the way we do journalism. I've got a question here from an anonymous person. Our company has spent a fortune on mitigating the spread of coronavirus. Do media houses have the resources to ensure that journalists have masks, sanitizers, do the deep cleaning? I mean, last week we talked about the economic impact of all of this. And of course, there's extra spending that's required here at the moment. Katy?
You have to make the resources available. And if it means taking from Peter to pay Paul, that's the way you've got to prioritize this, Franz. So yes, it certainly wasn't a line item in my budget specifically to have gloves and masks and sanitizers, but you've got to be able to do it. And it does inevitably mean that something else will fall by the wayside. So any special project perhaps that you had planned, or any kind of luxury budget that you had for a really nice investigative piece or a feature piece does need to fall away at this time. But you've got to be able to somehow find the resources to make them available, because prioritizing staff health and safety has to now become a priority. We've got such an important role to play as journalists. We've got to tell the story of COVID-19 and the way it's ravaging sections of our country. We've got to tell that. And if we're not well enough to tell it, South Africans can't also get a picture into what is happening outside of their homes. So it's really important for us.
I think I'll hold on to that line. If we're not well enough to tell it, then the audiences also suffer. So I want to turn to the safety issues that that were touched on earlier. And again, if you'll allow me, I want to just play a clip. I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A section, which we'll come to. And I just want to encourage others, if you want to join the conversation, please post, make some points there if you can. So this is a voice note from Azara Karim, a reporter from News 24, who talks about right at the beginning of the lockdown, being confronted by police in Johannesburg. Let's hear how she describes what happened
during the lockdown. So when they were running towards me, I didn't think that, they were coming for me until one of the officers aimed his gun at me and shot. And immediately I turned around and I ran away, and I just heard these shots going off behind me. And I stopped. I turned around and I put my hands up and I held my press card in my one hand, which was around my neck at the time. And as the officer approached me, he was about 5 meters away. I started screaming that, I was media. And I screamed it as loud as I could a couple of times. And despite that, he still shot at very close range. And I'm still surprised he missed. But so I turned around and I ran away again, not too far. And this time I did the same thing. I put my hands up and I held my press card, and the officer who shot at me approached me and then put down his gun and then said, "Why didn't you tell us you're media?" And I was like, I've been trying to. So anyway, they told me that they were having trouble keeping Yeovil residents inside, and then they asked me to leave, which I did, but I.
So that was one of the encounters that a South African journalist had. Muthoki, is this a pattern that we're seeing across the continent where people are being, where law enforcement is cracking down on journalists wrongly?
Yes, definitely. And unfortunately, it is a pattern that is developing across the continent and across the countries that I cover closely, that you're seeing law enforcement using their force disproportionately. In many countries, what's happening to journalists is a symptom of what's happening to the general population, that there is police brutality as they try to enforce COVID-19 measures. There's something that she said, that she spoke about the fact that she tried to identify herself and show that she had a media card and that this didn't help. And again, unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing. Of course, might be a good idea to be in a position to loudly and visibly identify yourself as a member of the press, but there are several cases that have been reported to us where journalists repeatedly shouted, "I am a journalist, I am a journalist," or people around them said, "That person is a journalist, you need to stop attacking them," or showed their ID, and unfortunately it had no impact. Of course, in one case that was reported to us, the assault actually became worse after someone identified them as a journalist, because this, again, the police brutality, the security personnel crackdown is overlapping with something else that we're seeing, that public officials do not necessarily want the highest level of transparency in reporting COVID-19, that they are trying to keep local meetings on COVID-19 private from the press, that they don't want journalists to report as openly and as critically on this matter as they ought to be reporting. So, long answer, that unfortunately it's a pattern that we're seeing developing and being repeated across the continent.
So what's to be done? I mean, what should we be doing to prevent this from becoming a pattern?
So there is no simple answer. Again, we have problems with, we have concerns about how IDs and identifications are being used to restrict movement of journalists at this time. But at the same time, we do think that if you're able, pragmatically speaking, if you're able to identify yourself as a journalist, maybe try to do that. But again, big caveat that this might not help the situation. And depending again on your context, it might actually make it worse, as we've seen in one case. But it's always a good idea. Secondly, we're also encouraging journalists to approach situations where they're going to report on COVID-19 as they might approach other hostile reporting environments. So to have the same type of preparation, to have the same type of skills and tools that you have in place, maybe when you're going to report on civil disorder, and to be aware of who you are and where you're going and how that's going to affect your safety. Something as simple as being aware of the fact that a rural community, for instance, might not exactly welcome outsiders coming in to report on COVID-19. Maybe if they fear that these outsiders might also be bringing in COVID-19, or the very basic fact that your race, your ethnicity might also pose a risk. We've seen this in places like Ethiopia. Newsrooms, of course, have a very important duty before, during, and after assignments to ensure the safety of their journalists. And this goes back to doing risk assessments, deciding what's worth it and what's not. And repeatedly, I recently participated in a webinar with freelance journalists where one of our safety experts was talking to them about the how to be safe while covering COVID-19. And repeatedly, the refrain that he had that I would like to share here is that if the risk is high, either because of who you are, your pre-existing conditions, the political situation, perhaps it's better to stay in, make a phone call, use the internet. But in the long term, obviously, what is going to resolve these things and to prevent them from being a pattern even beyond COVID-19 is tackling impunity. And this for us involves engagements with governments, pushing them to make sure that officers who have attacked journalists are brought to justice, that they're held accountable. Unfortunately, this is incredibly difficult in some countries because we've seen police officers even declining to record reports of journalists who say they've been assaulted. But guarding against the impunity, making sure that officers are held accountable, making sure that officers also know that journalists are essential services and that they need to be able to move around is really the long-term solution here.
Interestingly enough, I mean, Zara's story continues as though, I mean, as has been reported, that she really struggled to actually lay charges about this incident. So this issue of impunity is very real. Let me turn to a couple of questions that have been posed from people attending. From Monica Chibita in Uganda, how do journalists strike the balance between reporting the truth and alarming an already traumatized public? Anyone want to tackle that, Chiara? How do we find the balance between reporting the truth and traumatizing people?
I think the truth sets you free. I mean, I don't think you are going to traumatize people by saying what is actually happening and providing context for that. And if there are different versions of what is happening, presenting those in a balanced way. I think that the worst thing that can be done for anyone is not to bring the facts into the light of day and to discuss them in a balanced, objective way. If you look at what's been going on social media, all kinds of crazy ideas, crazy rumors, this person's died, there's, you know, it's just mad stories. We've seen a mass take up, which is the pattern internationally anyway, of our digital offering, but actually more than we expected and disproportionate for a small regional publication, because we're now kind of in terms of page views up there with the national big ones like IOL and News 24, and we're just a tiny paper. Part of that is, I think, people in our region and beyond, people from the Eastern Cape who aren't there, wanting to know what is really happening and turning to something they trust, a brand they trust, and our responsibility is to tell them, and even if it is bad news, not to cover it up, but to present it with comment, with the context and so on. We're encountering a lot of stigmatization and prejudice around the virus. People kind of trying to out someone with the virus, seeing it, you know, as this deadly virus, and it's part of our job to actually present truth about it. I don't think that's traumatic. I think, you know, if you're going to do a kind of half-baked job and melodrama, that would be problematic. Facts are facts, and how we're dealing with those facts is how people can then make decisions for their daily lives.
Franz, may I also jump in,
Sure.
if you don't mind?
Sure, go ahead.
So I really appreciate where this question is coming from in terms of striking this balance between information and alarming the public. But I would like to throw a bit of a spanner in the works and point out that this language that of alarming the public or causing public disorder is exactly the kind of language that we're seeing governments also deploying against journalists who try to report critically, or who in some cases try to report figures that are not necessarily official. So in this crisis, unfortunately, what we're seeing is an attempt to conflate official information with truth in some of the countries where we cover. And in that conflation, anyone who is reporting something that's slightly different or very different, or anyone who's using maybe different modeling figures is then accused of alarming the public. We had one case in Kenya where some journalists were called in to answer questions about a report they published claiming that a military facility was in restriction because someone there had been exposed to COVID-19. And then this becomes an issue because it's deemed false news, it's deemed alarming the public. So while I do appreciate very much the professional discussion that we ought to be having about striking this balance at this very sensitive time, we also have to keep our eyes open to the fact that this kind of language and these kind of allegations are also precisely what's being deployed against journalists.
And I think what you've previously said is that sometimes, I mean, the sort of common cause that we all have about the need to put true information out there provides cover sometimes for despots to crack down on information they don't like by simply claiming that it is untrue.
Yes, precisely.
Can I come in here as well?
Katy.
I just want to talk about the balance that we need to strike, as Chiara and Muthoki have rightly said as well. But it also comes in the kinds of stories that we're telling. So the facts are critical, they're upfront, and the most important facts are there, as we know. But in our case, we were running a 24-hour live TV station where our coverage has mainly been, like most news organizations, just about COVID-19. It's also about striking the balance with the kind of content that you are making use of and the stories that you're telling. So yes, there are the numbers, there are the infections, there are the deaths, there are the recoveries, there are the vaccine trials. Over and above all of that, I think we have a responsibility to also tell stories of people and how they're managing. Sometimes they are lighter stories. We've seen it on social media. We've seen people use their own coping mechanisms, and sometimes they're very, very light-hearted. And I think that also provides a level of breather for our audience, who does want to know the numbers, the deaths, the recoveries, but also wants to hear perhaps, you know, how their famous sports men and women are keeping fit in the confines of their own home. And we can tell that story in an interesting way as well. So I think the onus is on us to a degree to strike that balance and to also be very conscious of the language that we're using, because language is so powerful here. So if we're going to adopt a, dare I say, Donald Trump style vocabulary, I think we're all lost. And if we just use our language very responsibly, that's not alarmist, that is not in any way, you know, sensationalist or overly dramatic just for effect, then I think that we're doing a good and responsible job, because we do have a responsibility in all of this as the media.
Seeing as you raise the issue of balancing different kinds of stories, Katy, there's a question here. There are many other news stories that are not COVID-19 related, like day-to-day corruption, abuse of power. How do you balance the need to cover COVID-19 and other stories that are still of interest even in this crisis?
So it's a constant balancing act. On the one side, you've got a group of, or a team rather, of journalists who need to tell the stories. On the other side, you've got the stories that need to be told. And I think it's important that we reflect what's happening. If we know about it, if there's something that's worth telling, I think we'll definitely make the effort to tell those stories as well. But you've got to balance it out, as well as the fact that we're looking at what our viewers at the moment are interested in. Right now, there is an enormous interest in COVID-19, and it's about information. Everybody desperate to find out information. The latest bit of information coming out of South Africa at the moment is what's happening to our schools and when are schools likely to reopen. So it's a constant balancing act, while understanding that, yes, the world is focused almost entirely on COVID-19, there are other stories that need to be told.
And the reality is that actually those other stories are being squeezed aside. You know, there are all sorts of important things that are not getting airplay because of this, as you say, insatiable hunger for information on this one particular crisis.
Indeed.
I've got two related questions that I want to pitch at you, throw at you. One about freelancers. How are freelancers covered in these initiatives to protect and support journalists? And then another one which is kind of related, journalists in community media, those who don't have adequate resources to tell these stories to protect themselves. Any thoughts there from any of you? freelancers and community media?
Maybe I can jump in. Muthoki here.
Sure.
So the plight of freelancers has been of particular concern for us at CPJ, because everything that we've spoken about in terms of providing equipment, in terms of even doing a simple risk assessment, is something that newsrooms are ideally equipped to do. Freelancers often stand on their own. This is why a lot of the safety materials we are putting out are particularly meant for this kind of journalist who doesn't have the institutional resources to figure out the safest manner in which to go out and report. At the same time, we're also trying to target individual journalists with something that we're calling Ask an Expert. So any journalists anywhere in the world who feels like they're not particularly well equipped to go out and cover COVID-19 can come on the platform, and I'll share the link for this, can come onto our website and just sign up and request assistance from one of our safety experts to have a video chat about what's going on. We've also been doing it with associations. Most recently, we did it with the Association of Freelance Journalists in Kenya. The industries themselves, from what I've seen, are also trying but struggling to address the needs of various journalists who might not have the kind of power that a staff member at a media organization does. In Kenya in particular, I've seen the Media Council of Kenya providing grants to journalist associations, including a freelance journalist association, so that they can just cushion the associations themselves and their members against what's going on. So the plight of freelancers dire at this time. There are people out there, there are tools that we're trying to provide to address what's going on. And there are also organizations that are providing grants for journalists to try and weather this period. Some of them are targeted specifically at freelancers.
And community media, that was the other leg of the question. I mean, I think one of the issues that we have, and has been identified elsewhere, is that the economic crisis is really squeezing local journalism. And in Africa, in South Africa, that is often a question about community radio, community newsprint. What's to be said to them? I mean, there really are no resources. Muthoki, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Katy?
I'm not sure I have an adequate answer for this. Perhaps, again, the resources that we're providing, not just to freelancers, but again, journalists who don't necessarily have the big institutional capacity. I think this covers community media. I hope we're speaking about the same concept when we say community media. But at the same time, I have seen examples of smaller media houses trying to adapt, trying to change how they work, trying to change what they focus on. I think one of the local smaller media houses in Kenya is like completely just changing their reporting to get rid of field reporting, but also trying to be very robust in covering COVID-19 from home. So, I mean, there isn't an easy answer to this question. It's a question that we're all trying to grapple with. There are people who are trying to provide resources targeted at these journalists. Will it cover everything? I don't think so. But there are people who are trying.
Yeah. Katy, you wanted to say?
Yes, Franz, very quickly, with my SANEF hat on, actually, it's something that we're very conscious of as an industry, that freelancers and community media may regrettably bear the brunt of this because they don't necessarily have larger media houses behind them as backing. And it's something we're very conscious of. We've got to keep watching. What we're saying as an organization is that freelancers, local community media need to seek where they can potentially find funding. If there are any organizations giving funding at this difficult time, perhaps it is specifically for COVID-19 reporting, many funding opportunities available are for community organizations. So that's what we would certainly do as SANEF, encourage them to look at some funding models. But it's going to be a very difficult time. And I think our media landscape post-COVID-19 is going to have changed quite substantially.
Yeah, indeed. I think there will be a lot of change ahead. We're coming very close to the end of the time that we've got allotted. Very unfortunately, there are so many other issues to raise. Tsepo has prepared a short questionnaire, and he's going to put that up. We'd be very glad if you could just fill it in, just some feedback for us as we go forward. please do also send us emails on for suggestions of topics or feedback on this exercise. I was hoping that I could get Ishazara Muganzi just to very, very briefly put his point. Are you there, Isharaza? Yes, please go ahead. Very briefly, got only a minute or two left.
So my question was actually in regard to, amidst this crisis, there's a lot of talk, especially from government officials, that people should not be political, and every reporting, the kind of reporting that is being done, leaders, the presidents, or the officials that are responding to the COVID crisis tend to try to make the point that nothing should be politicized and that it's a time for everyone to come together. And that's a good message. But then at the same time, it's often used as an excuse to sort of set aside accountability, or in some cases, act with impunity. In Uganda, for instance, there was a situation where
okay, I think we get the point, Isharaza.
Yeah.
Sorry, we really are running out of time, but I think the point is clear. How do we tell what is political under these circumstances? Anybody want to respond in 2 seconds to that, Chiara?
Wow. I think at the end of the day, journalists have to be very clear who they account to. They account to the general public, to their readers, their audience, not to governments. So we'll support a government message in the interests of, obvious interests of public health. That doesn't mean we suspend criticism where it is justified, and it doesn't mean we suspend investigative journalism into the very government, security forces, or whoever who are enforcing lockdowns and quarantines. That's the only way you can actually go forward, is to always have that clear sense of who you are as a journalist, what is your job, and you are not a propagandist.
Yeah, I think that's, I think it's critical. You know, I started out this discussion talking about how our relationship with our audience has changed in the sense that we're in a sense really all in the same boat. But at the same time, as you say, it's really critical to maintain critical distance in the midst of everything. We need to continue to hold people to account, to check on what is being done. We really are out of time unless there is some very burning issue from someone. There are a couple of questions that we have not managed to get to around this question of embedment. As Monica says, news agendas, the effectiveness of using technology in this continent, given the lack of connectivity, working together between media houses. I'm afraid we will have to hold those questions in a sense for further discussion on Twitter and on other platforms. I want to conclude by saying thank you very much to everyone who is here, to people from places ranging from Nigeria to Sweden to even Cape Town and Kenya and all sorts of other places. It's been a most interesting discussion, and as always, it has to, in a sense, pause, not end. I also want to thank the panelists whose input has been really useful. I want to thank Tsepo Chabalala, who as always keeps the wheels turning in the background. Please do fill in the survey in the minutes that we've got remaining. We will post a recording of this event. We're already planning next week, and actually next week, coming close to World Media Freedom Day, we will use it to reflect on media freedom in the light of or during COVID-19. It may not be in exactly the same time, but just keep an eye open for the communications, and we hope you can join us then. Once again, thanks to everyone who was here. Thanks for the discussion, and we look forward to connecting here and elsewhere in the future. Thanks very much.